Scion is dead. Toyota killed it in February 2016, quietly, less than 15 years after building it from nothing. At its peak, in 2006, Scion sold 173,034 cars in a single year in the United States. That's more than Subaru sold that year, more than Mini, more than Volvo. By 2015, its final full year on sale, that number had collapsed to 56,167. Toyota didn't sell the brand off, and didn't spin it out into someone else's hands. It folded the whole thing quietly back into itself, as if it had never existed at all. Here's the part that doesn't add up. The executive who stood in front of reporters in 2003 and promised Scion would win over an entire generation Toyota couldn't reach was the same man who, 13 years later, signed off on ending it. Keep that in mind, because it says more about what actually happened to Scion than any sales chart ever will. By the time the brand shut down, more than 1 million people had bought one. 70% of them had never owned a Toyota before. On paper, that looks like a win. It's the reason Toyota still calls Scion a success story today. But it's also exactly why so many other people call that spin. Toyota spent more than a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to convince young America that a Toyota could be cool. For a few years it actually worked, better than almost anyone inside the company expected. Then it stopped working, and Toyota kept trying anyway, long after the sales numbers said it should quit. This is the story of how a car company built a brand from scratch to chase an entire generation, caught it, lost it, and then had to explain to the rest of the industry why losing it still counted as a win. To understand how Scion fell apart, you first have to understand how good it was at the very start. The fall only means something if the climb was real, and Scion's climb was one of the fastest brand launches the American car industry had ever seen. Toyota also wasn't the first company to try this exact move, and that history should have been a warning. General Motors had already built an entire sub-brand called Geo in 1989 to chase budget-conscious younger buyers, and by 1997 it was gone, quietly absorbed back into Chevrolet after early demand faded. Toyota studied that failure closely. It still walked into several of the same traps anyway. Toyota's problem, heading into the early 2000s, was simple and a little humiliating for a company that size. Its average buyer was pushing 50 years old. Honda and Nissan were pulling in 20-somethings with the Civic and the Sentra, and Toyota, already the biggest car company on the planet, was quietly becoming the brand your parents drove. Toyota had tried to fix this once before in Japan with a small youth-focused project called Will. It never gained real traction, and most people outside the industry never heard of it. So Toyota tried again, bigger this time, and in March 2002, at the New York Auto Show, it unveiled something genuinely different. Not a new model, an entirely new brand, with its own dealership network, its own pricing rules, and, on purpose, almost no visible connection to the Toyota badge sitting on the showroom floor next door. They called it Scion. It launched first in Southern California in June 2003 in just 105 dealerships selling 2 cars, the boxy little XB and the smaller XA hatchback. Every Scion came in exactly one trim level, at one advertised price, with no haggling and no hidden dealer fees stacked on afterwards. Toyota called it pure price, and for a generation raised on stories about their parents getting worked over at a dealership, that pitch landed hard immediately. Even some of Toyota's own dealers were skeptical at first, unsure whether a generation famous for skipping car ownership altogether would show up for a Toyota wearing a different badge. A year later, for the 2005 model year, the sportier TC Coupe joined the lineup, borrowing its 2.4-litre engine straight from the Camry and wrapping it in styling that traced back to the old Celica, starting at a little over $16,000. By 2006, Scion hit its high watermark, 173,034 cars sold in a single year, with a median buyer age of just 34 across the brand, and the TC alone pulling in buyers with a median age of 25. Toyota now had, by a wide margin, the youngest customer base of any car company selling in America. And none of it happened by accident. If you're watching this, you're clearly the kind of person who wants to actually understand how a business decision made 2 decades ago is still shaping the car industry today. That's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. So if that's you, go ahead and subscribe now, because this one only gets stranger from here. What made Scion work wasn't just the cars themselves. It was the marketing, and specifically, the marketing Toyota refused to do. There were almost no traditional television commercials in the early years. Instead, Scion sponsored underground music festivals, indie bands nobody's parents had heard of, and gallery shows staged in converted warehouses in Los Angeles and Brooklyn. It built a loose, deliberately cryptic promotional program called Scion Speak, designed to spread through word of mouth rather than ad spend, treating its own customers like insiders in on a secret rather than an audience being sold to. The XB became a genuine cult object almost overnight, a car people accessorize like a piece of furniture, backed by a factory customization catalogue deeper than almost anything else on the market at the time. According to Toyota's own internal tracking, brand awareness among under 35 shoppers in California hit 75% within Scion's first year on sale, a number most brand new nameplates take the better part of a decade to reach. Nationally, that number sat closer to 55%, but it was climbing fast, and every internal report Toyota published in those years pointed the same direction. Up. For a moment, it genuinely looked like Toyota had cracked something the rest of the industry couldn't touch. But then something changed. The crack started in 2007, a full year before most people in the country were using the word recession out loud. Scion sales dropped 24% that year, falling from 173,034 all the way down to 130,181. At almost the same moment, Toyota redesigned its flagship model, giving the second-generation XB a larger footprint, a far more conventional shape, and a starting price nearly $2,000 higher than before. The car that made Scion famous for being small, cheap, and a little strange got bigger, pricier, and considerably more normal, right as the market that loved it for being strange was starting to shrink underneath it. Then the actual financial crisis hit. In 2008, Scion sales fell by more than 16,000 units. In 2009, they collapsed by over 55,000 more. By 2010, annual sales had fallen all the way to 45,678, a drop of nearly 75% from the 2006 peak in just 4 years. Toyota told itself and told the press that this was purely a recession story. Every automaker was hurting, and a brand built entirely around entry-level buyers was always going to feel a downturn harder than most. Kelley Blue Book senior analyst Rebecca Linland later described it plainly. The recession derailed Scion's growth before it ever reached its intended volume targets. That explanation wasn't wrong. It just wasn't the whole story, and the part Toyota left out publicly was a lot uglier. Here's what almost nobody at Toyota wanted to say out loud in 2008. Scion's own customers were quietly getting older, and the company had let it happen without much of a fight. In 2004, the average Scion buyer was 35 years old, already impressive by industry standards. By 2007, according to trade publication AutoWeek's own tracking, that average had climbed to nearly 44. By 2011, industry analysts were pegging it at 43. The car built specifically to be a magnet for 20-somethings had somehow become just as popular with buyers old enough to be their parents. It wasn't really a mystery why. Retirees and empty nesters, drawn in by the low price, the simple no-haggle buying process, and the boxy XB's genuinely useful cargo space, started showing up at Scion dealerships in growing numbers. Longtime industry researcher Art Spinella noted at the time that in smaller markets, especially ones near retirement communities, Scion was quietly becoming a value brand for older budget-conscious shoppers instead of a youth brand at all. Toyota had built a car that solved real problems for young renters and retirees alike. Low cost, simplicity, no games at the dealership, and then acted almost surprised when both groups showed up looking for the same thing. The bigger problem wasn't the recession itself. It was that Scion never figured out how to hold on to the young buyers it had already caught, and Toyota stayed quiet in public about who was actually filling its showrooms instead. Toyota's answer to a shrinking, visibly aging customer base was to keep running the same playbook, just with new logos stapled onto it. In 2008, the XD hatchback replaced the aging XA. In 2011, the tiny IQ arrived to compete with the Fiat 500 and the Mini Cooper for city dweller attention. Neither car moved the needle in any meaningful way. By 2013, annual sales had fallen to 68,321, down another 7% from the year before, and Scion Vice President Doug Murtha was still telling reporters the brand was delivering on its goals, even while the sales figures were quietly saying otherwise. Edmunds.com senior analyst Jessica Caldwell later put it more bluntly than Toyota ever would in public. The Scion brand never quite caught on, the way Toyota had hoped it would. Around the same time, Murtha said something else worth sitting with. He told reporters Scion saw no evidence that a meaningful number of its buyers were actually willing to pay more for extra features or added technology. That's a reasonable thing to say about a brand built on rock-bottom pricing. It's also, quietly, an admission that Scion had boxed itself in. The entire model depended on staying cheap, which meant it could never chase the higher margin, better equipped segment of the market where the rest of the industry was already heading. That wasn't the only problem. While Scion kept refining tiny hatchbacks, the American car market itself was moving somewhere else entirely, toward SUVs and crossovers, and Scion had none. Not one. Every dollar Toyota spent keeping the XB, the XD, and the IQ alive was a dollar not spent building the one type of vehicle American buyers, young and old, increasingly wanted to drive. It's a mistake Toyota would never have allowed inside its own core lineup. Inside a side project built to chase a demographic instead of a market segment, it went unaddressed for years. By the time Scion shut down, SUVs and crossovers made up close to 40% of new vehicle sales in America. Scion's share of that number was zero, in every single year it existed. In 2012, in partnership with Subaru, Scion launched the FRS, a lightweight rear-wheel drive sports coupe co-developed with Subaru's own engineers and sold almost identically as the Subaru BRZ. Car magazines loved it without reservation. It won comparison test after comparison test against machines costing twice as much. But a beloved enthusiast car and a genuine volume seller are two very different things, and the FRS never sold in the numbers Scion actually needed to matter. By 2014, total Scion sales had slid to roughly 58,000 cars for the entire year, and the slide kept accelerating, down another 18.6% through the middle of 2015 alone. Not only had the recession hurt Scion years earlier, the brand's own identity had also quietly evaporated underneath it, while nobody was watching closely. In 2015, hoping for one more reinvention, Toyota turned to an unlikely partner. It brought in Mazda, which helped build two new Scion models, the IM hatchback and the IA sedan, essentially a rebadged Mazda 2 wearing a Scion grille. The cars that once defined Scion as strange, boxy and unmistakably itself had quietly been replaced by vehicles engineered by other companies, barely distinguishable from anything else sitting on a Toyota lot. The brand that started life as a rebellion against ordinary cars had, without much ceremony, become one itself. On February 3, 2016, Toyota made it official. In a press release issued from its headquarters in Torrance, California, Toyota announced that Scion would be folded back into the Toyota brand by the end of the model year. There was no press conference. There was no farewell tour. There was just a statement. All 1,004 Scion outlets, every single one of them already housed inside existing Toyota dealerships, quietly took down the separate signage and absorbed the warranty, financing and service work under the Toyota name. No factories closed. No workers lost their jobs over it. The brand simply stopped being a brand, almost overnight. Jim Lentz, the man who had helped launch Scion back in 2003 and was now CEO of Toyota Motor North America, delivered the line Toyota wanted the industry to remember. This isn't a step backwards for Scion, it's a leap forward for Toyota. IHS Automotive senior analyst Stephanie Brinley offered a colder read on the same decision, noting that dropping the brand would let Toyota cut the marketing and support costs of running a weak third nameplate. The FRS became the Toyota 86, The IA became the Yaris IA. The IM became the Corolla IM. Within months, the Scion badge, the dealership signage, and the entire separate identity Toyota had spent over a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars building simply stopped existing. Final full year of sales: 56,167 cars. Total lifetime sales across 13 years, north of 1 million. Average customer age at the very end, 36. Still the youngest in the entire industry, right up until the day the brand closed its doors for good. So what actually went wrong? It came down to 3 mistakes. First, Toyota built Scion's entire appeal around being cheap, simple, and hassle-free to buy, and never quite admitted that cheap and simple appeals just as strongly to a retiree on a fixed income as it does to a 22-year-old with a first paycheck. A youth brand that can't keep its own buyers young isn't really a youth brand anymore, no matter what the marketing says. Second, the moment the 2008 recession hit, Toyota let its single most distinctive product, the XB, grow up and get boring at exactly the point when its audience needed it to stay weird and small and cheap, and it left an entire SUV-shaped hole in the lineup that never got filled. Third, once the identity was gone for good, borrowing platforms from Subaru and then Mazda just to keep something new on the lot, there was nothing left separating Scion from a badge-engineered Toyota, with a few extra steps at the dealership. A brand only survives on borrowed identity for so long before customers notice there's nothing underneath it anymore. Toyota will tell you Scion succeeded because it pulled in over 1 million new customers and eventually funneled most of them into Camrys, RAV4s, and Lexuses down the road. In a narrow sense, that's true, and it's the version of the story Toyota is comfortable telling. But a brand that has to quietly shut itself down to prove it worked isn't a brand that actually won. It's a company that spent 13 years and a small fortune discovering that young America can't simply be bought with a lower price tag and a no-haggle sticker. It has to be earned again, one generation at a time, and Toyota learned that lesson the expensive way, one declining sales report at a time. There's a reason Toyota never tried this again. No new standalone youth brand, no Scion sequel, nothing. Instead, Toyota folded everything it learned directly into the Toyota badge itself. Cheaper financing programs, simpler trims, and eventually the same 86 that Scion helped build, now just wearing a different logo on the hood. Strangely, Scion's biggest legacy wasn't the brand at all. It was proving to Toyota that the fastest way to reach young buyers wasn't hiding the Toyota name. It was fixing what young buyers didn't like about Toyota in the first place. If you've ever owned a Scion, or you're still driving one right now, drop it in the comments, because this channel gets a surprising number of you. And if you want more stories about the decisions that quietly killed entire car brands, hit subscribe because there are a lot more of them coming.